Hollow eyes. It was one of those ordinary mornings. The sun had just begun its daily dance over the horizon, tinging the town with a yellow-orange hue. Birds began singing, filling the atmosphere. Sarah, a 20-something woman, led an ordinary life. She was a librarian, would often spend her weekends playing around with her friends, and she lived in her peaceful little house. Nothing remarkable ever seemed to happen in her life until that fateful day. It began with a conversation she overheard in the coffee shop. Two of her colleagues, Rachel and Mark, were talking animatedly about a mysterious place at the edge of town. Sarah had been in the middle of reading a book when their words broke through the silence. The words "old house" and "curse" caught her attention. She put down her book, pretending not to listen, but unable to resist the curiosity that crept up on her. "That house. It's been empty for years," Mark said, his voice low and almost reverent. Rachel took a sip of her coffee and nodded with a shiver. "They say it's haunted," she said. "No one who ever stayed there came back, at least not the same." "Haunted?" Sarah finally spoke up now that the interest was piqued. "What do you mean, haunted?" Rachel turned to her, her expression grim. "It is not like any ghost story you have heard. People say the house has eyes, not just windows, but something inside. Living, watching you, and once inside, you cannot escape its gaze." Sarah shrugged with a faint laugh and waved her hand to dismiss it as some urban myth. But with the rest of the day, she could not forget these words. Eyes that watch you. Alive. Waiting. It was no easy sleep for Sarah that night. Images of the house with its shadows on the walls and the feeling of those eyes behind the windows made their way around her brain like a horror movie in her head. Her thoughts were racing. The rational part of her dismissed it all, telling her that it was just a tale spun for amusement. But the rest of her, the part that had always been curious, adventurous, that part wanted to see it for herself. The following weekend, Sarah couldn't get the idea out of her head. She drove to the outskirts of town, toward the forgotten roads where the house was said to be. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. The air was chilly, a far cry from the warmth she'd felt earlier. It was as if the atmosphere had changed. As she turned into the unknown streets, and away from the familiar ones, the houses grew scantier. The trees would now grow taller, in all sorts of odd angles, appearing as if trying to shake off the light. In her car headlights, thin streams of fog cut deep. "There's nothing here," Sarah muttered to herself, her hands tightening on the steering wheel as unease started to settle in. Yet she could not turn around. Something, perhaps sheer curiosity, was pulling her forward. Then, just as the last street lamp disappeared behind her, Sarah saw it. At the end of the narrow road, nestled between twisted, gnarled trees, stood the house. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes staring out at her from the shadows. The building was dilapidated, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. Vines crawled up the sides of the house, intertwining with the wooden beams. No sign of life was apparent. No lights, no movement. Her heart was throbbing painfully in her chest. For a second, she considered driving away and telling herself that she'd come all the way for nothing. But her feet were already moving. She was getting out of the car. The gravel crunched beneath Sarah's boots as she made her way toward the house. Every step seemed to echo, too loud in the silence. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faintest scent of decay. The house loomed ahead, its presence overwhelming. Sarah paused in front of the half-open door, as if to invite herself in. Creaking hinges seemed to open the door to her. A low, haunting sound rose into the wind. Her breathing came faster, and she was sweating on the palms. She took a step forward, extending a hand which shook as she pushed open the door further. As she entered, a wave of cold air hit her, making her shiver. The house smelled like old wood, damp and musty. But there was something else. Something that she couldn't place. It felt wrong. The wooden floor creaked with each step she took deeper into the house. Peeling wallpaper covered the walls, and broken furniture littered the rooms as if memories were left there to be abandoned. A thick layer of dust covered everything, as if no one had entered here for decades. Suddenly she froze. Her eyes locked onto something that made her send a shiver up her spine. In the far corner of the room, across from her, was a painting. It was large, framed in gold, and hanging crookedly on the wall. The colors were faded, but the image was unmistakable. It depicted a woman, her face pale, her eyes wide, staring directly at Sarah. There was something odd about the eyes. They seemed to follow her wherever she stood. It was like the woman in the painting was looking at her, but also looking through her. Her lips were slightly parted as though she were about to say something, but no sound came. Sarah's pulse accelerated. She retreated slowly, her heart thudding against her chest. She could feel the hairs on her skin tingling, her breath coming in short pants. "No, this is ridiculous," she whispered to herself, shaking her head. But her feet refused to budge. The eyes seemed to draw her in, as if the painting were alive, as if the woman's gaze were reaching out, pulling her deeper into the room. Then a noise broke through the heavy silence, a faint creak, like someone walking on the floor above her. Her head snapped up, and she caught her breath. But nobody was there. The house was empty, or so it should have been. A chill ran down her spine. She was not alone. She turned slowly, scanning the room with her eyes. Now, every corner of it seemed darker. Shadows were oppressive now, as if the darkness had coalesced and assumed a life. And then she heard the sound of footsteps again, this time closer. They were heavy, deliberate strides, like someone was trudging slowly down the stairs. Her instincts screamed at her to run. Her feet wouldn't budge, however. She turned towards the stairs. Footsteps pounded louder and closer. A voice whispered in the distance, faint and hardly audible. Sarah. Sarah had never believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories were something she'd dismissed as mere tales designed to entertain or scare. Growing up, she had always seen logic in everything. A broken lamp wasn't haunted. It was just a broken lamp. Creaky floors weren't caused by ghosts, but by the house settling. But as she stood in the darkened hallway of the old house, those beliefs were starting to crumble. She had heard the footsteps. They were unmistakable, deliberate and slow, like someone walking right behind her. But when she turned, the hallway was empty, and the heavy silence returned, thick and suffocating. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching as her eyes flicked around the space, searching for any signs of movement. "It's just the house settling," she told herself, trying to steady her shaking hands. But as she stood there, the silence felt oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. A chill swept over her, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Her mind was racing, the fear creeping in like a shadow at the edges of her consciousness. She tried to move, but her feet were like lead. The shadows in the corners of the hallway seemed to be stretching out, growing larger, more menacing, the air becoming thicker with each passing second. It was as though darkness itself had a presence, pressing in on her from all sides. Her fingers curled around the old wooden banister, its smooth surface cold beneath her touch. The stairs stretched up in front of her, shadows swirling at the top like some dark abyss. She had to go up there. She couldn't just leave. Something was drawing her in, something she couldn't explain. She creaked on with each step. The creaking in the floorboards sounded like a warning to return. The house seemed to be screaming for her to turn back, to stay away. She tightened up her body in fear and breathed shallowly. Stairs seemed endless in depth as she climbed on into the unknown. She hesitated at the top of the stairs, gazing down the corridor, dark and foreboding as the one below. The rooms were shut tight, with doors ajar, like silent sentinels watching her every move. She heard it again, the faintest whisper, like a breath against her ear. Sarah. Low, almost inaudible, it sent a chill running through her veins. Her heart thudded against her chest as she quickly turned, expecting to see someone there. But no one was. Her breath caught in her throat. It was just the wind, she reasoned, but the rational part of her mind was losing its hold. She was no longer alone in this house. Something, or someone, was watching her. She could feel it. Sarah's legs moved before her mind could catch up. The hallway seemed to shift around her, the walls pressing in, narrowing as she approached the first door. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that her breath became visible in the dim light. She pushed the door open, the hinges creaking louder than they should have. The room was dark, filled with old, forgotten furniture. But there was something else. Something unsettling. A large mirror stood against one wall, its surface cracked, its reflection distorted. As Sarah stepped closer, she could see the faintest flicker of movement in the glass. Initially, she thought it was her reflection. The movement in the mirror, however, did not follow hers when she moved. There was, in the dim reflection, a figure standing behind her. She spun around and her heart leapt to her chest. No one was there. Yet in the mirror, the figure was still there, staring perfectly still with the face shrouded by shadows. Sarah stumbled backward, her hand grasping the doorframe for support. Her breath came in short, frantic gasps as she stared at the mirror. The figure remained, watching her from the darkness, its eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. The air around her felt thick, suffocating, like the room itself was alive, watching her every move. "What is this?" she thought, her chest rising with panic. She took another step back, her body shaking. Without warning, the figure in the mirror moved. Slowly at first, then with terrifying speed, it reached out toward her. Sarah screamed, slamming the door shut and stumbling away from it, her mind reeling. She didn't know anymore what was real. The footsteps, the whisper, the figure in the mirror. It was all just too much. She needed to go. She needed to get out of this house before whatever was watching her moved. Sarah sprinted down the hallway, racing. She must get out of there, must get away. The house closed in around her now, its walls moving, shifting, its shadows growing larger. She leapt the stairs, feet tangling over one another as she descended desperately, desperate for the door. But as she reached the bottom, she froze. The door, the one she had entered through, was no longer open. It was locked. Her mind went blank. The door had been open when she entered. She had seen it clearly. But now it was sealed shut, the wood heavy and unyielding. Footfalls, more distinctly and nearer. Again she heard the sound. Sarah turned round, eyes in utter dismay. And there it was at the top of the stairs, the figure again. Same figure that one in the mirror had cast. Face still covered up by darkness, its burning embers of eyes flickered bright. "It is coming for me," she thought with a gasp. She reached out blindly to grab the doorknob and pull hard against it. But the doorknob would not give way. Her pulse raced as she turned toward the windows. She had to escape. She had to get out before it was too late. The figure moved, descending the stairs slowly, its eyes never leaving her. And then, as if it had been waiting for this moment, it spoke. "You can never leave." The voice was a rasp, like the sound of 1,000 whispers woven together, and it made Sarah's skin crawl. She backed away, her chest tight with terror. Who are you?" she gasped, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It just kept coming, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the fear that was emanating from her. And still Sarah screamed, her brain crumbling into rubble. She ran towards the closest window, smacking fists onto the glass trying to make her escape. but glass wouldn't crack. It hadn't even chipped. Then in the reflection off of it, she saw something that chilled her veins. Eyes. The bright glow of eyes. Bright glow eyes. There wasn't much morning sunlight attempting to cut through all that hung in the sky and crept along on everything around like a massive quilted blanket. Sarah had barely slept the night before. Every creak, every groan of the house seemed to have been speaking to her, whispering things she couldn't understand, but things that sent the hairs on her neck up and crawling. She didn't know how long she lay awake, eyes wide into the suffocating darkness. Shallow breathing quickened, listening for a sound, waiting for it. It's just my mind playing tricks, she tried to convince herself. But the shadows in her room felt too alive, the air too cold. The feeling of being watched, a sensation that had never left her, was growing stronger. Whatever had followed her into this house was no longer a figment of her imagination. It was real, and it wasn't leaving. With the sun's weak rays finally piercing the haze outside, Sarah decided that she had to find some answers. She couldn't stay in this house forever, not like this. The walls felt as if they were closing in on her, and every time she tried to get a grip on reality, it slipped further away. What was going on? What had happened to this place? And most of all, what was that thing? That thing that was always just out of sight, hiding in the shadows, lurking in the corners of her mind. She moved cautiously around the room, every sound amplified in the silence. The house was too quiet, too still. It was almost as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She took hesitant steps down into the house, feeling it more weighty than before, almost as if it was conscious of her now, as if it were listening, watching, waiting. The creaks under her feet seemed purposeful now, as if the boards wanted her to stay longer. The kitchen was empty like the rest of the house, thick dust having settled over everything. But it was the table that had her attention. There, in the center of the room, sat an old journal. It seemed to stand out like a sore thumb, as if it did not belong in this forgotten house. She went forward with a caution, half expecting it to disappear or some unseen force to stop her. But nothing happened. The journal sat still and silent, as if waiting for her. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the heavy leather cover. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded, and the handwriting, scratchy and erratic, filled the pages. As she read, Sarah felt a chill grip her spine. It watches me. It waits. Every night, it comes closer. I can hear it breathing. She could feel her pulse racing. The words reflected what ran in her mind, what terrified her. But this journal, this was from another. Someone who had lived in this house long before she had ever set foot in it. She flipped through the pages frantically, desperately seeking more answers. Every line was drenched in fear, every page thick with terror. She had found someone who wrote about the same things that had happened to her. The footsteps, the whispers, the eyes watching in the shadows. But the final word struck her as most memorable. The eyes are everywhere. The journal fell out of her hands, thudding softly on the floor. Her heart was racing, her breath shallow and erratic. She couldn't believe it. Whoever had written this had been trapped here, like her. And what was worse, they hadn't survived. Her mind spun around in circles. Was she going mad? Or was the house itself actually alive, feeding off their fear, stalking them from within? The air became thick and suffocating as Sarah tried to push the increasing panic aside. She had to go. She had to get out. But as she turned to move toward the door, a voice resounded through the room. Sarah. She halted, her blood turning to ice. It wasn't in her mind. It was real. The voice was coming from the walls. At first, she thought it was just her imagination playing tricks again. But then the walls seemed to groan in response, the floor beneath her feet creaking as if the house was alive, shifting, responding to her presence. The voice whispered again, this time louder, more insistent. "Sarah, Sarah, come closer." Her body stiffened, her breath quickening. The walls pulsed with an unseen force, and for the first time, Sarah realized that the house wasn't just a place. It was a living thing, a thing that wanted her, needed her. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, just the walls, just the shadows, closing in around her. The house was closing in. With sudden clarity, Sarah knew what she had to do. She had to find a way to communicate with whatever was inside the house, whatever was behind the walls. It had to be here. She had to learn its name, learn what it wanted, or it would consume her as it had consumed so many others before her. Sarah's hands were shaking as she looked around the room. Everything in the house seemed to have amplified. Every noise, every whisper. She moved through the kitchen, looking for something, anything that would give her a clue to unlock the mysteries of the house. That was when she saw it, a faint crack in the wall behind the counter. It was barely noticeable, hidden by the shadows, but Sarah had always been observant, and now it seemed impossible to miss. The wall had been disturbed. She put her hands on the crack, feeling the stone below her fingertips. Gentle pressure, and the wall gave up. The passageway was dark, the stale air thick with dust, but Sarah felt an unsensed pull, a driving force that pulled her on. She couldn't go past it. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside, the darkness swallowing her whole. The house was more than a place. It had become an entity, an unrelenting force that wrapped around Sarah like a suffocating blanket. Every inch of it seemed to pulse with life, the shadows growing longer and darker with each passing hour. The walls started whispering in a language she didn't understand, but that didn't matter anymore. She could feel the words deep inside her chest, vibrating with a sickening rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the dimly lit candle sitting on the table. Her skin felt clammy, cold sweat running at her temples, yet the candlelight, pale as it was, had given her some small bit of reassurance. She couldn't explain it. She couldn't make heads or tails of the bizarre pull she felt toward this passage she had discovered beyond the wall. It seemed to be calling her to it, beckoning her into the unknown. She had avoided it, stepping instinctively away from it, but the more she resisted, the stronger the force grew. As if the house wanted her to go in, wanted her to descend into whatever lay beneath. And so, though fear overwhelmed her, Sarah knew she could not resist. She had to go through with it. The air around her was thick, oppressive as she walked toward the entrance of the dark passage. Deep, jagged cracks lined the walls, as if carved by some ancient force, something far older than the house itself. With every step she took, the temperature dropped, and she felt the walls watching her, following her every movement. As she stepped through the passageway, her nostrils filled with the faint smell of mildew and rot. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand erect. She didn't have any idea of what awaited her there, but this was a moment of no return. The house possessed her now. She simply had to know the truth. The dark just seemed to push into Sarah from all directions the farther she traveled down into the ground. Water collected on the walls of the passageway, making her steps sound strange as she went. It felt as if every footfall shook like thunder through the emptiness around her. Her heart beat loudly in her ears, pounding with rhythmic cadence over any other sound. Finally, what seemed like a lifetime, she saw the bottom. There was a faint, low murmur. It was nearly imperceptible, more of a whisper, yet it still vibrated with an actuality that hummed to the very base of the floor beneath her feet. Sarah's breath caught within her throat as she pushed open the door into this room. She had problems adjusting to the dark around her, yet what she saw made her heart seize, The room was enormous, much larger than it should have been for a basement. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old, dusty objects, each covered in a thick layer of grime. But it wasn't the objects that caught her attention. It was the strange symbols etched into the walls. Symbols she had never seen before, but that felt oddly familiar. She could feel them, feel their energy seeping into the room, into her very being. They pulsed with a dark force, an ancient power, and as Sarah took a step forward, she felt something stir beneath her feet. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of decay. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to explain what was happening. That's when she saw it. A huge wooden door is on the far end of the room. It looked old and worn. It was all wrong, though. The wood is cracked, and beneath it, some sort of stain oozed out with a deep red color on the floor, as if someone had splattered blood across it. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she realized the liquid wasn't just anything. It moved. She had to know. She had to see what was on the other side. As Sarah approached the door, the whispers from earlier returned, louder now, more insistent. She could hear them clearly now, their voices crawling into her ears like insects. "Sarah, come closer. We've been waiting for you." She shivered as she reached out for the handle, her fingers shaking uncontrollably. She paused for a moment, but whatever was on the other side of the door was pulling her with a force she couldn't resist. She turned the handle, and the door opened with a creak. In it, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In unnatural darkness, the room was enveloped with a void that seemed endless, and in the heart of that darkness was a figure. It towered over her, tall, impossibly so. Its body was shrouded in a black mist that seemed to writhe and twist. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a hollow mask. Two dark, empty eyes which stared directly at her. It didn't move, didn't speak. But Sarah could feel it watching her, its presence suffocating and oppressive. The air grew colder, and the whispers became deafening, a chorus of voices screaming inside her head. "You shouldn't have come. It's too late now. You're ours." Panic flooded through Sarah's chest. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. The room was now alive with the sound of the whispers, the walls pulsing, as if they were breathing. The air was thick, heavy, oppressive, and her legs felt like lead as she tried to move. Every step was like wading through thick mud. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She had to get out of here. She couldn't stay here. Her mind whirled. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Her fingers brushed the cold walls, desperate for any kind of escape, any sign of hope. And then, she felt it. A soft, cool breeze. At first, it was faint, but it grew stronger, colder. A crack appeared in the wall beside her, small at first, but it widened rapidly. A shadow moved in the gap, and Sarah recoiled, heart hammering. It was the thing, the entity. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she felt like it was looking directly into her soul. "You belong to us," the voice whispered, sending a chill down her spine. "You always have." The shadow lunged at her, its misty form swirling around her like a living nightmare. Sarah gasped, feeling its cold touch on her skin. But before it could engulf her completely, the crack in the wall widened further, the shadow retreating back into the void. With all the strength she could muster, Sarah ran for the crack, her body trembling with fear. She could feel the thing's eyes on her, its cold presence just behind her as she squeezed through the narrow opening. The cold air of the basement passage wrapped around Sarah like a shroud as she stumbled out from the crack in the wall. Her breaths came in sharp, shallow gasps, and her legs trembled beneath her. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, to escape the house and the horrors within it. But something in her heart told her the nightmare wasn't over yet. The shadows swirled in the hallway in unnatural ways, whispering in low tones. Words were no longer nonsensical. They were now clear and deliberate, one striking fear into her heart with each word. "You can't leave. You are part of us now." Her heart thumped in her chest, and her fingers clutched the rusty candlestick she had grabbed earlier. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. The house groaned ominously, as if alive, shifting and creaking with a malevolent intent. She realized she was no longer in the basement. The narrow stone corridor had changed into a great hall, with its high ceiling decorated by cracked, faded murals of eyes staring down at her. The air was thick with the nauseating stench of decay. There, in the distance, glimmered a faint light. The shadows it cast flickered, like living things, running across the walls. Terrified, Sarah felt her attraction to it, impelled by a force that outweighed her fear. She moved forward, and with each step, crunching through broken glass and debris on the floor. As Sarah drew closer to the light, she felt a strange rhythm in the air, as if the beat of a giant heart. The sound grew louder with each step she took, echoing through the cavernous hall. Her hands trembled as she reached the source of the light, a massive, ornate mirror. Its frame was carved from blackened wood, depicting twisted, grotesque figures locked in eternal agony. The glass of the mirror shimmered, but it didn't reflect her. It reflected the house, alive and pulsating like a living organism. The walls shifted and breathed, and the shadows moved with purpose. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing the cold surface. The instant she made contact, the whispers became screams, deafening and agonizing. The mirror rippled like water, and she was pulled inside. She landed on her knees, slipping into a room that was both familiar and alien. It was like the living room of the house, but everything seemed distorted, as if it was being seen through a warped lens. The furniture twisted and contorted. Walls seemed to melt into each other. Shadows were given faces, with hollow eyes that watched her move. "Why have you come here?" a voice boomed, shaking the very ground beneath her. Sarah spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. Standing in the center of the room was the entity she had seen before, but now it was fully formed. Its hollow eyes burned with an unnatural light, and its elongated limbs seemed to stretch into infinity. "I didn't mean to," Sarah cried, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to know why this house is this way." The entity chuckled, the sound both cruel and sad. "You have always belonged to this house, Sarah. You are the key. You are the curse." Her mind spun. "What are you talking about? I don't belong here. I don't even know this place." The entity drew closer, its shadow embracing her. This house was built on pain, on sacrifice. Every brick, every stone soaked in suffering. And you are its final offering. The entity raised a long, shadowy hand, and air around Sarah became heavy. Visions flooded her mind. Images of a family she didn't recognize, their faces twisted in anguish. A man, eerily similar to hers in features, hammering in the final nails into the house's foundation. A woman, screaming as she was dragged into the basement. Sarah grasped her head, buried by a wave of memories not her own. "No, this isn't real," she screamed. She knew, however, in a secret place deep down, that it was true. The house was part of her, its evil connected with her blood. She was the descendant of the man who had made it, who had sinned upon it. "You can't escape your fate," the entity hissed. "You have to fulfill the cycle." "No!" Sarah shouted, finding a spark of defiance within her. "I won't be a part of this." The entity's hollow eyes narrowed. "You have no choice." The shadows surged toward her, their twisted forms reaching out with claw-like hands. Sarah gripped the candlestick tightly and swung it wildly, the metal connecting with one of the shadowy figures. To her surprise, it recoiled, hissing in pain. A glimmer of hope sparked within her. She wasn't helpless. The mirror, she thought. It had to be the way. If it brought her here, it might be the way out too. Dodging grasping shadows, Sarah made a break for the mirror. The entity roared in anger, its form shifting and expanding to block her path. The house itself seemed to fight against her, the floor buckling and the walls closing in. With what little strength she had remaining, Sarah flung herself towards the mirror and drove the candlestick into its glass. The mirror shattered in a million pieces, and the world around her broke open in light. As Sarah's eyes opened, she was lying on the front lawn of the house. The sky above her was clear, with no sign of the oppressive darkness. The house was silent and unmoving, with its windows dark and lifeless. She slowly sat up, her body aching, but alive. The whispers were gone. The shadows did not move. It was just a house once more. Or so it seemed. As she walked away, she couldn't help but think that it was watching her, waiting for the next unlucky soul to stumble upon it.